I worked with the digitization of old maps, not collectible ones, archival maps. The kind that never ended up in museums because they were too practical, too imprecise, too temporary. Most of them contained errors. Coastlines shifted too far east, rivers flowing where none existed, mountains drawn where the land was flat. For centuries, cartography was more interpretation than science. But this era was different. On several maps, created in different countries in different centuries, the same detail appeared. A small marking, usually without a name, sometimes drawn as an island, sometimes as a point on land, sometimes just a thin, empty circle, always in the same location. It appeared on maps from hundreds of years ago, on military charts, even on an old-school globe from the early 20th century. The coordinates matched. I checked them against modern systems, satellite imagery, topographic data, radar scans. According to everything we use today, there was nothing there. No land, no island, not even an anomaly, just open ocean, flat, empty. At first I assumed it was coincidence, a cartographic myth, a copied mistake that no one ever bothered to verify. That assumption ended when I found a handwritten note in the margin of one map, written in small, careful letters. Do not remove. Unstable point. It wasn't a cartographer's comment. It was a warning. I began collecting every map that showed the point. I spread them across my desk, comparing coastlines, scales, annotations. The longer I looked, the clearer the problem became. The place was never drawn the same way twice. On one map, it appeared as a small rocky island. On another, as a stretched strip of land, like the edge of a forgotten continent. On a third, it was marked only by a thin circle, uncolored, unnamed, as if the cartographer wasn't sure what they were seeing. But the coordinates were always the same. The shape changed. The location did not. I moved on to old ship logs and expedition journals. Most were chaotic, full of exaggeration and navigational errors. But in several of them, written in different languages by different hands, I found the same kinds of entries. Land sighted on the horizon, gone by dusk. Island not present on return along the same route. Compass behaved erratically in the vicinity. None of the accounts described storms or shipwrecks. No panic, just confusion and unease, as if the sailors hadn't encountered something hostile, as if they had encountered something that wasn't always there. In a hydrographic report from the early age of modern measurement, the area was described differently. Where older maps showed land, the report listed only irregular depth readings. The seabed there wasn't consistent. Sometimes deeper, sometimes shallower. Sometimes the measurements failed entirely. At the end of the report, someone had added a sentence in a different ink. The object is unsuitable for permanent mapping. That was when it became clear to me. This wasn't a mistake repeated by maps. It was a place that refused to stay fixed. The deeper I went into the archives, the more things began to disappear. Not dramatically, systematically. Files that had been on my access list the day before were suddenly marked unavailable. A scan of a globe I had saved locally became corrupted overnight. It felt less like sabotage and more like quiet housekeeping, as if someone was tidying up after me. So I started looking outside official collections, private archives, auction photos, forums for old map collectors. That's where I found it, a chart with a clearly marked erased zone. There was no name, no legend, just an irregular pale area where the ink looked worn thin, as if someone had scrubbed the same spot over and over again. In the margin, written in pencil, was a short note from a previous owner. After this voyage, we were forbidden to make changes. I contacted him. His reply came days later and was frustratingly brief. The map, he said, came from a family archive. His great-grandfather had served as an officer on a merchant ship. After returning from one particular voyage, the man reportedly said only one thing: "There is no land there, but something is." I couldn't let it go. I checked modern nautical charts, the kind updated constantly with real-time data. In that area, they always showed a smooth, uninterrupted surface of water. But when I layered data from different days on top of each other, subtle differences appeared in color and texture, as if the surface of the ocean wasn't behaving the same way there. I also found a brief reference to a maritime exclusion zone that had existed for a short time. The official reason was navigational uncertainty. No further explanation was given. Unofficially, nowhere written down. The reason was simpler. You couldn't return along the same route. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about a hidden island. It was about a place that didn't always agree to exist. I decided to do something simple. I checked the coordinates again. I entered them into several independent navigation systems using the oldest recorded values, the ones written before modern standardization. Each system returned a slightly different location. The differences were small, dozens of meters, sometimes a few hundred, too precise to be dismissed as transcription errors, too large to be ignored. The coordinates were drifting. I compared the data by date. The newer the source, the farther the point seemed to slide, as if a place that had once been easy to pin down was slowly slipping away from the grid we forced onto the world. In a forgotten archive, I found correspondence between two hydrographic institutes. Officially, it concerned data reconciliation. In reality, it read like a series of increasingly uneasy questions. Why doesn't the point match yesterday's measurement? Are we certain the vessel occupied the same position? Can external influence be ruled out? The reply arrived weeks later. It was brief. Further attempts at precise localization are not recommended. That wasn't a scientific conclusion, it was an administrative decision. Attached was a map showing a newly defined buffer zone. The marked area was larger than before, as if someone were trying to contain something that moved slower than a ship but faster than continents. At the bottom of the document, a handwritten note had been added: "The location is not stable in time." That was the first moment I allowed myself the thought I had been avoiding. Maybe the maps weren't wrong. Maybe the place itself was moving. I started looking for a name. Every place, even a mythical one, eventually gets called something: an island, a reef, a point of reference, a word that allows people to talk about it without explaining everything from the beginning. This one didn't have that. On the oldest maps, I occasionally found small notes written in cramped script, almost like footnotes. They appeared in different languages, spelled differently each time, but the meaning was always similar. It wasn't a geographic name. It was a description of function. In a Latin annotation, the phrase could be translated as place of return. In a Portuguese log, the wording suggested a point that receives. On a map drawn by a Northern European cartographer, there was only a symbol and a short warning: do not linger here. The most disturbing source was a ship's journal, written over several days in the same hand, growing more uneven with each entry. The author never named the place, not once. Instead, he used the same phrase every time: that place, as if giving it a proper name would make something permanent. At the very end of the journal, written carefully as though meant for someone else to find, was a single sentence: if you try to name it, you try to fix it, and it does not tolerate being fixed. That was when I understood that the absence of a name was not an oversight. It was deliberate. Names impose order. Names make things stay where they are. And this place existed outside of order. I found a reference to the last recorded attempt to reach the place. It wasn't a scientific expedition. It wasn't military. It was an ordinary merchant voyage that drifted too close. According to official records, the ship never returned. It didn't sink. It didn't send a distress call. It wasn't listed as lost at sea. In the registry, its status was marked with a phrase I had never seen before: unresolved voyage. Only in a set of private notes, never entered into the system, did I find a clarification written in the margin by a port official. The vessel returned, but not to the same location. The crew's account was brief and immediately classified. They described several hours of complete disorientation. Compasses spun slowly without settling. The sky looked wrong, not stormy, just unfamiliar. The ocean was unnaturally calm, its surface too smooth, as if wind had forgotten how to touch it. Then, without warning, everything returned to normal, except the coastline. The harbor lights were different. The landmarks didn't match their charts. The port they entered was real, but it was not the one they had departed from. The crew insisted that the sea had given them back, just not where it took them from. The ship was seized. The sailors were separated. The documentation was sealed. Officially, the incident was attributed to a navigational error of unknown cause. Unofficially, a single sentence was written in a restricted appendix: the location is not a destination, it is a passage. That was when it finally made sense. The reason the place could not be found today wasn't because it had vanished. It was because it was never something you sailed to. It was something that sometimes passed by you. There was one more category of sources I had avoided until then: accounts no one had tried to verify because there was nothing to verify them against. Letters without addresses, journals without dates, memories written down years later as if their authors had been afraid to commit them to paper any earlier. They all described the same thing: the moment of overlap, a brief period when the world seemed to lose its alignment. The horizon no longer matched the ship's movement. The waves traveled in one direction while the wind blew in another. The sky appeared deeper, as if it had gained an extra layer. And then it appeared, not an island, not land, a presence. Some described a vague outline rising from the water, something that didn't cast a shadow. Others said it felt like the ship had slipped elsewhere for a few minutes, even though it never left the sea. One sentence appeared again and again in different hands. It didn't last long, but it lasted long enough to be remembered. Afterward, Everything returned to normal. Compasses stabilized, stars slid back into place, and the map was empty again. In one journal, I found a note that felt less like description and more like an attempt at understanding. We did not reach it. We reached the moment when it was possible. That was when it became clear why fixed coordinates had never worked. Because the place did not exist continuously. It existed periodically, as if the world opened slightly just for a moment and then closed again, leaving no trace behind. Someone tried to go back. In a military archive I accessed by accident, I found a report labeled "Not Subject to Classification." It wasn't secret. It was simply outside the system, as if no one knew where it belonged. It described an attempt to recreate the moment of overlap. The team wasn't looking for the place. They were looking for the conditions, the same star positions, the same atmospheric pressure, the same wave behavior, everything that could be measured, recorded, repeated. They never reached the location, but they reached the time. For a few minutes, the instruments began returning contradictory data. Radar showed something the cameras couldn't see. The cameras captured distortions of light where the radar reported nothing at all. Then one of the operators said something was wrong with the map. Not an error. The map had stopped being current. The geographic grid shifted slightly. Familiar outlines trembled, as if the system was trying to draw something it did not know how to represent. The report ended abruptly. No conclusions, no signatures, no closure date. At the bottom of the final page, written by hand, was a single sentence. You cannot return there because it was never there. It was then. After reading the report, I began to notice something I had ignored before. Not traces that led to the place, but traces that led away from it. In sailors' accounts, in private letters, in marginal notes by cartographers, the same pattern appeared. After encountering that place, something changed. Not immediately. Sometimes days later, sometimes years. People began to react strangely to maps. Not professionally, physically. Some reported dizziness when staring too long at coordinate grids. Others described an unsettling feeling that borders and lines were not where they should be. One cartographer was quoted as saying, "If you look at them long enough, they start looking back." The most disturbing cases involved people who tried to draw the place from memory. Every sketch ended the same way. The page filled with corrections, smudges, lines erased and redrawn until the paper tore, as if the hand knew it shouldn't finish the shape. In a private letter, I found one sentence that still follows me. The place does not want to be remembered whole. It only leaves the feeling that something was wrong. That was when I understood something crucial. The inability to find it wasn't a failure of navigation. It was a protective function. Because if the place could be found at will, someone would eventually try to keep it. And it does not tolerate being kept. The last document I found wasn't a map or a report. It was an instruction. Short, dry, anonymous, written as if no one wanted responsibility for it. It didn't explain how to find the place. It explained how not to look for it. It warned against synchronizing too many data sets at once, against layering old charts onto modern systems, against searching for patterns where nature never needed them. And above all, it warned against trying to name what refused to be named. At the bottom of the page, written in a different hand, was a final sentence. If it appears again, you will recognize it not by coordinates, but by silence. That was when I understood it hadn't vanished. It had simply stopped being where we left it. It may still exist, but only when conditions align, when the world loosens for a moment, when the lines we use to describe reality fail to hold. That is why it cannot be found today. Today, everything is too precise, too stable, too confident. Old maps were drawn in a time when the world was not yet fully closed. Sometimes, when I look at modern satellite images, I notice a stretch of ocean that seems unnaturally flat, as if depth itself is missing, as if something almost appeared but didn't quite make it through. And I think the place is still there, not as a point, not as an island, not as coordinates, but as a possibility. And if it ever appears again, it won't ask whether we are ready, because it never belonged to maps. Maps were the ones trying to belong to it.